Now I give the floor to the Representative of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. From the perspective of Saint Vincent and the Grenadines, it is impossible to overstate the importance of the issues of narcotic drugs and our international cooperation in addressing the problem. We therefore welcome this opportunity to address these topics and welcome the numerous reports and studies that have been generated, particularly the outcome of the high-level segment of the 52nd session of the Commission on Narcotic Drugs, documents A/64/120 and A/64/123. To these documents, we also commend for the consideration of this Assembly the UNODC's World Drug Report and Annual Report for 2009. We also stress the continuing relevance of the UNODC's 2007 report entitled Crime, Violence and Development, Trends, Costs and Policy Options in the Caribbean, and its 2008 document, The Threat of Narco-Trafficking in the Americas. Also, we continue to align ourselves with the statements made by CARICOM before the Third Committee on 8th October 2009. Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, up until very recently, was an economy that relied primarily on banana exports to the United Kingdom. However, in the face of challenges made to the World Trade Organization by other large banana interests and the United States, which does not grow a single bunch of bananas, our preferential access to the UK market is fast disappearing. Today, we are producing less than half of the bananas we grew only 10 years ago. In 1992, Windward Island bananas exports to the UK represented 274,000 tons, or a 45% share of that market. Today, we ship less than a quarter of that amount to the UK, and our market share is in the single digits. The resulting unemployment, rural poverty, and sudden social dislocation have presented a number of difficult challenges to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. One of these is an increase in marijuana cultivation in the remote hills of our country's interior, where producers destroy ancient, old-growth rainforests to cultivate hundreds of acres of cannabis herb. A single recent raid by our regional security forces uncovered over 700,000 marijuana plants and 3 million seedlings in one area. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, unfortunately, has now become one of the Caribbean's major marijuana producers. However, those responsible for this rise in production are not noble farmers eking out a living in hostile conditions. Marijuana production has rapidly morphed into an elaborate criminal enterprise, orchestrated by heavily armed drug barons and gangs, often from other countries. Law enforcement officers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines are seizing ever-increasing numbers of ever more sophisticated firearms, which are directly linked to narcotics trade and trafficking in our country and our region. Mr. President, the UNODC's Crime, Violence and Development Report for the Caribbean states that, and I quote, murder rates in the Caribbean at 30 per 100,000 annually are higher than for any other region in the world and have risen in recent years for many of the region's countries, unquote. According to its report titled Threat of Narco-Trafficking in the Americas, the UNODC posits that, quote, the Caribbean is such a diverse region that it is difficult to explain the widespread recent escalation in violence in terms other than those relating to the drug trade. This drug trade is the most pressing and immediate threat to the security of our region. UNODC reports that about 20% of the cocaine destined for North America currently travels through the Caribbean, with increasing amounts of synthetic drugs also passing through our region en route to markets in developed countries. The Southern Caribbean is increasingly being utilized as a transshipment point and is particularly favored by drug producers from certain South American states. The UNODC also suggests that the Caribbean will continue to play an important and possibly increasing role in future drug transit. Mr. President, according to the UNODC's Crime, Violence and Development Report for the Caribbean, and I quote, The Caribbean is especially vulnerable to crime for several reasons. It suffers from the disadvantage of being situated between the world's source of cocaine, the Andean regions of South America, and its primary consumer markets, the United States and Europe. As small islands, Caribbean countries and territories have large coastlines and territorial waters to control relative to their ability to fund law enforcement coverage. Small criminal justice systems are easily overwhelmed in terms of police, courts, and prisons. Police must deal with seasonal tourist inflows, and in some countries, the number of annual visitors actually exceeds the size of the local population. The Caribbean has some of the highest prisoner-to-population ratios in the world, and overcrowding interferes with their rehabilitation process, unquote. This description is particularly apt for Saint Vincent and the Grenadines. The 32 islands of our archipelago, with their rugged coastlines and vast seascape, are patrolled by a mere handful of Coast Guard vessels. Our justice system is crowded with drug-related crimes and criminals. Further, one cannot overstate the ease with which a single, relatively minor drug baron can threaten the very foundations of our region's small societies. In countries like ours, with only a few hundred largely unarmed law enforcement officers, one heavily armed drug gang, no matter how insignificant in the global scheme, can seriously threaten to undermine the state's legitimate monopoly on coercive force. The developmental repercussions of this drug trade and its associated crime are profound. The UNODC has estimated, for example, that, quote, Haiti and Jamaica could double their annual economic income if they could bring their crime rates down to Costa Rica's level, unquote. This drug trade is therefore a very real threat to our regional growth and development. Mr. President, we welcome the outcome of the high-level segment of the 52nd session on the Commission of Narcotic Drugs, particularly its recognition of the multifaceted challenges faced by transit states and its call for increased technical and financial assistance to states most directly affected by the world drug problem. This is indeed a global problem, and the human and financial costs of combating it cannot be borne by states like ours, which are essentially transit points for drugs on their way to North American and European markets. The studies that have been written are voluminous and detailed. The onus is now on governments, particularly in those states whose demand fuels the drug trade, to demonstrate the necessary political will to cooperate fully against the drug problem. It is better for us to hold hands in cooperation than to point fingers, and the cost of ignoring this problem is far greater than the cost of confronting it head-on. At the same time, the interconnectedness of the world drug problem to other global issues must be acknowledged and addressed. Surely, it is preferable for international trading regimes to carve out exceptions and export preferences for what are essentially de minimis producers of legitimate agricultural goods than it is to force them to choose between unemployment and the production of illicit cash crops. The global economic and financial crisis has also added to the list of international maladies which are not created in the Caribbean, but that disproportionately affect our sub-region. The list includes climate change, an iniquitous international trade regime, small arms trafficking, and narcotic transshipment. Make no mistake, without active and aggressive assistance to small, vulnerable, and poor countries like ours, the yawning social, political, and economic cleavages being caused by this global economic crisis will only increase the attractiveness of illicit drugs and their disastrous global implications. Further, the link between narcotics and the trafficking of small arms is strong and irrefutable. We cannot afford continued dalliances by arms-producing countries that fail to comprehend the need for meaningful controls on the flow of small arms and light weapons. The time is long since past for an enforceable global accord on this matter.